p477. What is put into these boxes? Petitions asking pardon? Not only, sometimes denunciations too, from beginners. The cultural and educational section sorts out that they are not to go to Moscow, but to the office next door. And what else? Well, the inexperienced reader is not going to guess. They were also inventions, the greatest inventions, intended to turn all modern technology upside down, or at any rate to liberate their inventors from camp. There are many more inventors, and as also poets, among plain ordinary people that we imagine, and in camp especially. One has to try to get released, right? Invention is a form of escape which doesn't involve the risk of a bullet or a beating. I'd line up before work and after with hand-brows and picks, these servitors of the Muse Urania, she is the closest you can come, wrinkle their brows and strive to invent something to astound the government and fire its greed. Here is Lebedev, a radio operator from the Koverino camp. Now that he has been turned down, there is nothing more to hide, and he admits to me that he discovered a deviation of the compass needle from the odor of garlic. From this he had envisioned a way to modulate high-frequency waves with an odor, and thereby transmit an odor over a great distance. However, government circles did not see any military advantage in this project and were not interested. That meant it didn't come off. Either go on bending your back or think up something better. One or another fellow, truly very rarely, would be suddenly taken off somewhere. He would not explain or say anything himself, so as not to spoil things, and no one in the camp could figure out why this particular person had been taken off somewhere. One might disappear forever, and another might be brought back after a time. He would still not say what it was about, so as not to become a laughing stock, or he would put on an air of great mystery too. This too was typical of the sex, telling something to exaggerate their importance. But having myself been on the islands of paradise, I had had the opportunity of seeing both ends of the pipeline, where this got to and how they read things there. And here I am going to allow myself to amuse the patient reader of this not so very cheery book. There was a certain Trushlikov, formerly a Soviet lieutenant, shell-shocked in Sevastopol, taken prisoner there, dragged subsequently through Auschwitz, and as a result of all this a little touched. He managed to propose from camp something so intriguing that it led to his being brought to a scientific research institute for prisoners, i.e. a Sharashka. There he proved to be a genuine fountain of inventions, and no sooner had the chiefs rejected one of them than he immediately proposed the next. And even though he did not get one of these inventions to the calculating stage, he was so inspired, so impressive, spoke so little, and had such an expressive look that not only did no one dare suspect him of swindling, but one of my friends, a very serious engineer, insisted that in the profundity of his ideas, Trushlikov was the 20th century Newton. I, it is true, did not follow up on all his ideas to the very end, but he was entrusted with working out and preparing a radar absorber which he himself had proposed. He demanded help in higher mathematics, and as a mathematician, I was assigned to help him. Here is how Trushlikov set forth his idea. In order not to reflect radar waves, a plane or a tank must be covered with a certain material made up of many separate layers. What sort of material this was, Trushlikov never told me. Either he had not yet selected it, or else This was the inventor's main secret. The electromagnetic wave had to lose all its energy through the multiple refractions and reflections back and forth at the edges of these layers, and now, without knowing the characteristics of the material, yet making use of the laws of geometric optics and any other means available to me, I was supposed to prove that everything would work out as Trushlikov had predicted, and in addition select the optimal number of layers. Naturally, I could do nothing, nor did Trushlikov do anything either. Our creative alliance collapsed. Soon afterward, Trushlikov brought me, in my capacity as a librarian, I was also a librarian there, a requisition for an interlibrary loan from the Lenin Library, without indicating authors or publications. The requisition consisted of the following: something relating to the technology of interplanetary travel. Since we were only in the year 1947 at the time, the Lenin Library had almost nothing to offer him other than Jules Verne. People thought little of Tsiolkovsky at the time. After an unsuccessful attempt to set up a flight to the moon, Trushlikov was expelled thence into the abyss, back to camp. But the letters kept coming and coming. I was subsequently attached, this time as a translator, to a group of engineers investigating the piles of claims to inventions and patents coming from the camps. A translator was required because many of the documents arriving in 1946 and 47 were in German. But these were not claims to patents, and they were not voluntary compositions either. It was shameful and painful to read them. They had all been extorted, exacted, sweated out of German war prisoners, for it was clear that we could not succeed in holding these prisoners as war prisoners for all eternity. It might be 3 years or it might be 5 after the end of the war, but sooner or later they would have to be released. Actor Heimat. It was therefore necessary during the years they were here to squeeze out everything which could be useful to our country. We had to try to get even this pale reflection of those German patents that had been carted off to the Western zones. I could easily picture how it had been done. The unsuspecting and dependable Germans were instructed to report their fields of specialization, where they had worked, and in what capacity. Then, naturally, the Security Operations 3rd Section summoned all the engineers and technicians into their office, one at a time. They were first questioned with respectful attention. This flattered the Germans about the kind and nature of their particular work in Germany. They had already begun to think that perhaps they would be given more privileged work instead of camp work. Then a signed agreement on non-disclosure was required of them, and once somebody is verboten to a German, he will not violate it. And finally, they were confronted with a harsh demand to set forth in writing all the interesting details of their field of production and describe any important technical innovations used there. Then the Germans came to realize belatedly what kind of trap they had been caught in by bragging about their former jobs. But they could not just write nothing at all now, for they were threatened in that moment of never being allowed to return to their motherland, and in those years it seemed quite likely. With tormented consciences, depressed barely, pushing their pens, the Germans wrote. The only thing that saved them and enabled them to avoid giving away secrets was the fact that the ignorant security officers were incapable of fathoming the true nature of their testimony and valued it according to the number of pages, and we, going through it, were hardly ever able to find anything substantial. The information was either contradictory or buried in the scientific fog with omission of the main thing, or else they seriously described technical innovations of a type well known to our grandfathers. But the claims to patents in Russian, what servility they sometimes reeked of. Once again, one can easily picture how these were written, how there in camp, on a pitiful free Sunday, the authors of these claims carefully hid what they were writing from their neighbors, probably lying and saying they were writing petitions for pardon. Nor could their dim minds foresee that it was not the lazy, well-fed leadership that would read their calligraphy addressed to the sovereign, but plain ordinary sex like themselves. And we leafed through 16 big pages, paper-bagged from the cultural and educational section of the most detailed proposals, 1 on the use of infrared rays for guarding camp compounds, 2 on the use of photoelectric elements for counting the number of prisoners departing from the gatehouse, and the son of a bitch included drawings too and technical elucidations. And the preamble was as follows: Dear Yosef Vissarionovich, even though I have been sentenced for my crimes under Article 58 to a long term of imprisonment, even here I remain devoted to my beloved Soviet government and wish to assist in the secure guarding of the fierce enemies of the people who surround me. If I am summoned from the camp to receive work as the necessary means, If I am summoned from the camp and receive the necessary means, I guarantee to make this system work. Now this was a political for you. This treatise went from hand to hand among us. Amid exclamations and obscenities, all of us were sects. One of us sat down to write a review of the project. The project was technically illiterate. The project did not take into consideration. The project did not provide for unprofitable, unreliable. It would lead to a weakening rather than a strengthening of camp guard. What are you dreaming of today, Judas, at your distant camp? I'll shove a pole down your throat, drop dead rat. And here came a packet from Vorkuta. The author claims that the Americans have an atomic bomb and our motherland hasn't. He writes that at Vorkuta, he often ponders this fact, and that up there, behind the barbed wire, he wished to help the party and the government, and therefore he heads to his project, Dan, disintegrating the atomic nucleus. But he has not perfected this project, a familiar picture, because of the lack of technical literature at the Vorkuta camp, and if there were any other literature there either, as if there were any other. And this savage merely asks us to send him in the meantime instructions on radioactive disintegration, and after which he will undertake to complete his project for Dan. Behind our desks we roll with laughter and almost simultaneously come to the same vulgar evaluation. This here, Dan, is a blanking sham. And meanwhile, really great scientists were done in and perished in camps. But the leadership of our dear ministry was in no hurry to seek them out there and to find worthier uses for them. Alexander Leonidovich Chizhevsky served his whole term without ever being in a sharashka, even before camp. Chizhevsky is very much what a favor in our country because he had found a connection between revolutions on Earth, biological processes on Earth, and solar activity. His scientific scope was out of the ordinary. The problems he concerned himself with were unexpected and did not fit into the convenient, accepted classifications of the world of science, and it was not clear how they could be put to use for military or industrial purposes. Today, after his death, we read articles praising him. He established that the incidence of myocardiac thrombosis is 16 times greater during electrical storms. He correctly predicted flu epidemics. He was in quest of a technique for the early discovery of cancer based on a graph of the subsidence reaction of red corpuscles, and he advanced the hypothesis of zeta radiation from the sun. The father of Soviet space navigation, Korolev, was, to be sure, taken into a sharashka, but as an aviation scientist, The Shrashka administration did not allow him to work on rockets, and he had to do that work at night. We don't know whether L. Landau would have been taken into a Shrashka or shipped off to distant islands. He had barely confessed with a broken rib to being a German spy, but was saved by the intervention of P. Kapista. Konstantin Ivanovich Strakovich, the great Russian specialist in aerodynamics and an extraordinarily versatile scientific mind, after traveling on a prisoner transport from Leningrad prison, became an auxiliary worker in the bath of the GULag camp. He now relates the whole story with his innocent childish laugh, which he amazingly retained through his whole tenor. After several months in a death cell, he then survived a serious attack of dystrophic diarrhea in camp. After that, they assigned him to guard the entrance to the soaping room. When the women's brigades were taking baths, they had to assign stronger people to deal with the men. He couldn't have handled it. His task was to be sure that the women entering the soaping room wore nothing and had empty hands, so that everything went to the fumigator. Most of all, the bras and panties, which the medical section considered the chief centers of lice infestation, and the women tried it particularly hard not to turn in and attempted to take through the bath with the and Strakovich looked like this. He had Lord Kelvin beard and a forehead like a craggy cliff, with a brow double the ordinary height. You could hardly call it a forehead at all. The women pleaded with him and insulted him and grew angry at him and laughed at him and invited him to accompany them to a pile of twig brooms in the corner. Nothing moved him. He was merciless. Then they unanimously and maliciously nicknamed him the Impotent, and suddenly, one fine day, the authorities came and took this impotent off to be in charge of no more, no less than the first turbojet engine project in the country. But of those scientists who were allowed to die in general work, we know nothing. And as for those arrested and destroyed in the heat of scientific discovery, like Nikolai Mikhailovich Orlov, who back in 1936 had worked out a method for long-term preservation of foodstuffs, how were we to find out about them? After all, their discoveries were shut down, following the arrest of the men who made them. In the fetid, oxygenless atmosphere of the camps, the sooty flame of the cultural and educational section would sputter and flare up, casting the merest glimmer. But people would be drawn from various barracks and from various brigades even to this little flame. Some came with a direct purpose to tear paper from a book or newspaper, to make a smoke, to get paper for a petition, or to write with the ink here. Ink was not permitted in the barracks, and here too it was kept under lock and key. After all, ink can be used to forge rubber stamps. And some came just to put on airs. See how cultured I am, and some to rub elbows and chatter with new people. Someone other than their boring fellow brigade mates, and some came to listen to others and report to the Godfather. But there were still others who didn't themselves know why they were inexplicably drawn there for a short evening half-hour, tired as they were, instead of lying in their bunks, allowing their aching bodies to rest a little. These visits to the cultural and educational section brought the soul a mite of refreshment in imperceptible and unobvious ways, even though those who stopped by were altogether the same sort of hungry sacks as ones who stayed sitting in their brigade multiple bunks. Here they didn't talk about rations, nor of portions of cereal, nor about norms. People here didn't talk about the things that made up camp life, and therein lay a protest of the heart and some relaxation of the mind. Here they talked about some kind of fabulous past which just could not have existed for these gray, famished, bedraggled people. Here, too, They talked about the indescribably blessed, free-moving life out in freedom, and those fortunates who had somehow succeeded in not landing in prison. And people also talked about art here, sometimes so magically. It was as if someone, when an evil spirit was raging, had drawn on the ground a weakly gleaming and foggily flickering circle, and it was just about to go out, but as long as it hadn't, you could at least imagine that within that circle, for those half hours, you were not in the power of the evil force. Yes, and then too, someone would sometimes be plucking at a guitar. Someone would be softly singing a song that was not at all the kind permitted on stage. And someone and something would stir within you. Life exists, it exists. And looking happily around you too, would want to express something to someone. However, speak only guardedly. Listen. But keep pinching yourself. Take G. He was an inventor and a student who had not completed the course in the Auto Engineering Institute. He was planning to increase the efficiency of motors, but they took away all his notes when they searched his place. He was also an actor, and we were putting on Chekhov's The Proposal with him. He was a philosopher too, and was adept at such cute expressions as, "I don't want to worry about future generations. Let them scratch around in the earth for themselves. I myself cling to life just like this." He demonstrated by gripping the wood of the table with his fingernail. Believe in lofty ideas? That's something to be said in a telephone, with the wire pulled out. History is a disconnected chain of facts. Give me back my tale. An amoeba is more perfect than a human being. It has simpler functions. If you listened to him, he would explain in detail why he hated Lev Tolstoy, why he was intoxicated by Averbakh and Alexander Grin. He was also an obliging chap who didn't avoid hard work. He would hammer away at a wall with a cold chisel. True, in a brigade guaranteed 140% of the norm. His father had been arrested and had died in 1937, but he himself was a non-political offender imprisoned for forging bread ration cards. However, he was ashamed of his own swindling article and tried to get closer to the 58s. He tried and tried. Oh, so pleasant and interesting lad, clinging to life. G. testified as a witness for the prosecution, and it was a good thing you hadn't said too much to him. If there were eccentricities in camp, and there always were, they could not avoid dropping in on the cultural and educational section. They were bound to look in. Thank you for listening.